Our second speaker today is maybe an unknown quantity to us in this room, or to many of us in this room, but in his own field and in his world, he has already achieved the radical. Aishwary Kumar looks like he shouldn't be old enough to graduate. But apart from a stellar range of academic qualifications, he is a political theorist, he is a political philosopher, he is an intellectual historian, he is an expert in South Asian studies. Above all, he has taken a field that has been dominated by a certain way of doing things and shown that it is always possible to do differently. Two great thinkers of our time, Gandhi and Ambedkar, who have shaped the democracy we live in, who have shaped the very identity of being Indian, have been under his radar and come out looking differently from how they ever have. We're going to have a fascinating conversation, and for that, may I invite Aishwary Kumar.
Can I begin by just thanking everyone for
You can begin any way you like.
Although it's a difficult act to follow. But thank you everyone for...
I know, we set you up a unique challenge. Okay, before we just come to the work itself, I wanted to ask what in your life, or what in your growing years inclined you to scholarship?
I did not consciously begin by thinking I would be a scholar. And I think that that sort of an ambition to becoming a scholar defeats its very purpose. True scholarship should thrive in a certain sort of contingency. When we come to a certain question, something bothers us, something troubles us, and we then start to strive and answer that question. And for me, growing up in the late 90s and doing my doctoral work in the early 2000s, it was clear that the time for some true conceptual struggles had arrived. And by conceptual, I don't mean simply academic struggles. These were struggles that were real, these were struggles that were political, and these were struggles on which perhaps hinged the very future of our political life. And it troubled, I think, not just me, but a generation of scholars around whom I grew up, that the frameworks we had been taught and we had inherited, such as, the idea of India and so on, were breaking and ripping apart at the seams. Something had to be retaught in order to preserve what we had inherited after a considerable struggle itself. And to answer those questions required a kind of both academic rigor in the boring sense of the term, but also I think it required a sustained political commitment. And I think it's the unity of moral puzzle or moral impasse and political future that scholarship helps us unpack.
So will you articulate for us what were the questions from which emerged your book, Radical Equality, and we'll come to the book, but what was the seeking to which that book was the answer?
Simply put, in a word, it was inequality. It was inequality all around us. But more importantly, or more precisely, it's our growing acceptance of that inequality, that violence around us. We feel absolutely numb to social and political cruelty around us, and increasingly so. It used to be the fact that violence or cruelty were extraordinary events in our social life, in our political life, in democracy as such. But now it has become an ordinary vice. It's the most ordinary thing we witness when we go out to meet people, go out to vote, and so on. So the relationship between inequality and violence drew me to the problem that the book poses. And I could not, if there is a better thinker of human indignity and inequality than Ambedkar, I do not know of him or her.
So, Aishwary, till Radical Equality, till your book, all scholarship around Gandhi and Ambedkar has hinged on their very, very combative, supposedly combative or dueling ideas. It is, depending on who you ask, if it's a Gandhian or if it's an Ambedkarite, the other is a bit like the television nightly debates. The other person is Arnab, and whoever you represent is, at that point, the legitimate victim of the other. Your work placed them for the first time in an entirely different context. They were studied together, their complementarities, and I think you came to a very, very interesting way of looking at both thinkers that did not preclude one or the other from being a hero. Will you talk us through this? Both your relationship with both thinkers, and then your approach to the work itself.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big question.
We have time.
Yeah.
Roughly after this, I'm going to shut up for the next 30 minutes.
Yeah. I mean, let me begin by saying what the fundamental problem is that these two address in their own very singular, if incommensurable ways. The problem is simply this: can there be a democratic politics that is dependent on notions of moral, political, and biological purity? That is to say, can purity be a truly political notion? And if you look at Ambedkar, one of the two thinkers, what fascinates me about Ambedkar is that for him, the very origin of inequality begins with notions of purity around our thinking. Purity of blood. He writes a lot on endogamy, purity of sexes, purity of nationalities, and so on and so forth. And one of the things he proposes is that no constitution, he's celebrated as this father of the constitution, but Ambedkar is very clear: no constitution will save us if we do not have the moral fiber to actually stand for that constitution. And we cannot stand for it as long as we are mired in this language of purity.
So what did he do to upend that language of purity?
I think the hallmark of Ambedkar as a thinker, which is how I treat him, first and foremost as a thinker. The guy lost pretty much every election he fought. He was bad in politics. And Gandhi was celebrated as this apostle of nonviolence, indifferent to political fortune, actually commanded the single largest anti-colonial party in his time. So there I flip the mirrors through which we have come to understand these thinkers. And the stakes are very high. I think for Ambedkar, every modern problem that seems irresolvable or insoluble has a certain ancient or classical remnant. And there is absolutely no modern thinker who goes, in India at least, who goes back to those classical traditions, to Manusmriti and so on, with that degree of intellectual rigor. And I use rigor in a very serious sense of the word, because there are times when Ambedkar would declare, he's the guy who burns the Manusmriti in Mahad, in Maharashtra. He is the first to concede that this is a work of genius. There is rarely a text that achieves that level of calibrated use of power that the Manusmriti achieves. Right? So he's someone who's first and foremost a thinker of concepts. And before he goes on to deface or ruin these concepts,
he can celebrate.
He has the ability to see how robust and how enduring they are in their very toxicity.
He had a special reading, I think, of the Gita, and that's a very interesting it seems to occupy a special place in his reading of the scriptures. Would you talk us a little through that?
Yeah, the Gita is, we all know, is almost an unavoidable classical text in modern India. And this has been the case for a while. For a very long time, almost every seminal or important thinker who wrote about the Gita or wrote extensive commentaries, and there are extensive commentaries on it, Tilak in Maharashtra, Gandhi in Gujarati, and so on. When Ambedkar comes to it, he's the first one who says, why is it that as a society of readers of texts, we sometimes tend to miss the most important dimension of these texts? Why is it that political or social reality is right in front of us with all its textual evidence, with all its sanction for routine violence, and yet we are unable to grasp violence in such a distilled form? And he goes to the Gita, like other people around him, and he says, it's striking that almost no nationalist thinker of the time, among whom we credit some with formulating what we today call the idea of India, has actually stated the obvious, that the Gita is actually a text of fratricide. It's a text on killing brothers if the desire and ambition for political power requires you to do so. And from there, with that singular, if perhaps deceptively obvious insight, begins, or Ambedkar mounts this profound criticism of the idea of India.
So we'll come back to Ambedkar and the idea of India, but to the second part of my original question, to Gandhi and your reading of Gandhi, and then your reading of their relationship.
Right. Gandhi, of course, is more widely read. When I started working on radical equality, or reading Ambedkar seriously, I did not, for example, know that this would become a 400-page book. There was absolutely no book-length study of Ambedkar as a moral philosopher.
That's
at that time, yeah. I remember being at international workshops on the Gita, for example, and so on, and almost invariably, you would be the last speaker.
You're not the last speaker today.
No, but I saw it as a great chance, because finally I thought Ambedkar was having the last word. And in itself, that spoke to the moral power, but also the philological heft of his thinking. Gandhi, on the other hand, is more celebrated, for that reason alone, no less widely misunderstood. And that's the underside of Gandhian thought that pulled me most strongly.
What are the fundamental ways in which you believe Gandhi is misunderstood?
The most important insight you glean from Gandhi is his ability to formulate a kind of political Hinduism, or let's say, for the lack of a better term, political religion, that is resistant to extreme forms of nationalism, religious nationalism. But in making that case, we have to be extremely careful, because I think some of the fundamental problems of Indian nationalism that today take on such fundamentalist forms have some bearing on, or some resemblance to, certain practices that were very close to Gandhi. And I think that this is what we call, in an academic sense, the impasse or the aporia. Gandhi's an aporia.
How have you looked at the Gandhi-Ambedkar relationship differently from before? What was that lens that you brought? Was it to their shared, if I paraphrase, then it is very different politics, very shared intent. Right? What was common to their intent, and where were the fundamental differences that caused there to be such a public schism between their worldviews?
The most fundamental difference is, again, on this particular statement that Gandhi makes somewhere in his journal, Harijan.
Would you just speak closer to the mic?
Yeah, sorry. It's that he says the problem does not lie in the fourfold division of society, the Varna, Ashrama, Dharma, as we know it. The problem lies in our faulty conception of inequality. So Gandhi is committed to a certain form of moral inequality. He embraces that inequality, and this is what makes him a radical. He believes that the notion of political equality is a modern ruse for mastery of all sorts. Of course, it is, Ambedkar says. Of course, giving every person one vote is important for that form of formal equality. But what will change our horizon is our ability to rethink what inequality really is. And inequality stems not from my commitment to treating someone as a help or a servant or a domestic labor or bonded labor. Inequality stems from the fact that we are willing to see our social life in terms of irreducible or insoluble antagonisms. That somewhere we believe that no matter, and this we see in our own times, there's a line we draw, right? Even liberals draw that line when they say, I'm a completely secular liberal, but when it comes to women entering certain temples, I draw the line. There are liberals who will say, I'm against the death penalty, but when it comes to Afzal Guru, I draw the line. This line drawing, I think, this propensity to line drawing is what Ambedkar excavates from our moral impasse.
And you're saying Gandhi was more, is it just that Gandhi was a better realist?
There is, yes, that's a great point. I mean, there is a case to be made for Gandhi's realism, except that it is him who is seen as this apostle who breaks from the realities of political life. And it is Ambedkar who is seen as somehow pragmatic, somehow a realist, somehow who tries to solve social problems through constitutional legislation. He's not interested in that. I mean, we do not have another constitutional thinker in the annals of constitutionalism globally who, after spending the most painstaking years of his life on the Constitution, is willing to say, I will burn this thing down. Right? Because constitutions will not save us. It is our ability to get past these insoluble antagonisms, this hostility in everyday life that way.
Caste played, obviously, a big role in this, in both their lives, but also in centering the conversation around inequalities. And I think they had very different approaches to caste. Gandhi did not believe caste per se was the problem as much as, I think, getting rid of untouchability would solve the caste problem. And Ambedkar was entirely of a different worldview. Will you talk us through this? And again, was Gandhi merely being realistic about what could be achieved? Did Ambedkar represent an ideal that is not livable?
In the strongest and most idealist sense of the question you asked, yes. Because one of the things he clearly says is that you can either have one or the other. You can have a constitutional democracy grounded in principles of moral life and moral equality, or you can have Hinduism. Choose. I mean, that's the stark choice. And Ambedkar does not take religion lightly. I mean, remember, and this is another thing that gets lost in the debates around reservations in our own time again, is that he converts to Buddhism, to another religion, with close to 500,000 people in an event that has completely been blacked out for most part, even from our school curriculum. It is difficult not only to speak about Ambedkar in an intellectual sense, it is actually difficult for us to conceive of him as a thinker. And he is someone, and that there is a reason for that, because he undermines the civilizational idea of India, which, I mean, basically what he says is all civilizational ideas of India are Hindu ideas of India. You cannot eradicate that inequality which Hinduism brings with it without annihilating caste and vice versa.
Will you then, and I know this is a big ask, distill the core of what Ambedkar proposed, what he stood against and what he proposed, and I don't only mean constitutionally, I mean with regards to Hinduism. How did he propose Hinduism be recast, and how did he propose the choice between a constitutional state and Hinduism be navigated?
Yeah. You know, one of the things that is difficult for us in the way we are trained to think about politics on TV or in schools, the way we read and understand things, is one of the missing lessons of our political thought is that counterintuitive formulations are difficult to arrive at. And Ambedkar is a master of counterintuitive formulations. He does not say that the Hindu is unreasonable. Or the Manusmriti is totally toxic, or violent. He says, does the Hindu have the freedom to use reason? I quote him here, that's the formulation he uses. Which can mean two things. One, that the Hindu has no reason, or that the Hindu does not have the freedom to use the reason he already has. And he begins counterintuitively by looking at the problem of human freedom. Hinduism is a second order problem for him. It is fundamental to Indian life, but it is not fundamental to political life per se, because there can be, according to him, a political life in which we can live, and live well, without Hinduism, but the notion of freedom will be crucial.
So, how have we come to occupy a place where a sort of spiritual responsibility as a Hindu stands in for your political duty? How have we conflated the idea of politics with the idea of being a good Hindu?
I mean, that has a very long and not very celebrated genealogy. And I'm sure there are more people in the audience who know more about that genealogy. I think if you look at someone like Gandhi, and this is what, again, attracts me to Gandhi, because he offers the most heterodox interpretation of Hinduism. There is an episode in which, in the 20s, the Garhwali Rifles are ordered to shoot at a crowd of unarmed satyagrahis, passive resistors who are protesting. And the Garhwali Rifle soldiers refuse to open fire, saying that they disobey the orders because this would be a massacre. Gandhi publishes a piece a few days later. In fact, he's asked by someone what he would advise, whether he would celebrate that act. And he says, no. I think the Garhwali soldiers have committed a crime by not shooting on unarmed protesters. And in that moment, you see a certain unity being achieved, not in Gandhi only, or Gandhi alone, but in Indian political thought, where political life has become completely inseparable from the oppressive duty of the office. And it is that commitment to, that almost juridical commitment to office that we have come to inherit, this love for the office.
How have we then arrived at a place where both Gandhi and Ambedkar, because if they stand for one thing, it definitely stands for an examination of Hinduism as it has been cast. How have both been so comprehensively, if not appropriated, then at least attempted to be appropriated by the Hindu right? In what way of seeing Gandhi and Ambedkar, can the Hindu right find resonance?
The Hindu right is extremely sophisticated in being shallow. They do it very well, and they really encash it. So something like Swachh Bharat is a good example. It's a Gandhian, it will make our everyday life better, we will have smart cities, and so on. How Gandhian is that? And so, of course it's very easy to appropriate strands in certain thinkers, especially after you have assassinated them. Once the difficult part is done, all that remains is consecration. And that is what has happened with Gandhi. That has happened again in a more troubling form with Sardar Patel, who now has the dubious distinction of being the highest man on the planet. Ambedkar's politics is way more inappropriate. You just can't really appropriate him.
Why do you say so?
I think one simple reason is you read a line of him and the raw intensity with which he critiques, or not even just critiques, he forces us to look inwards, is absolutely incompatible with the idea of Hindu nationalism. I mean, Hindu nationalism is not very strong. I mean, introspection does not come easily to them. And Ambedkar forces us to turn our lens inwards. He never says, don't be a Hindu. All he says is, understand what being free means, and it is likely you will cease to be a Hindu. So that's the counterintuitive turn in his book. He comes first to freedom, and then to Hinduism. And it is for that reason, I think, substantively, that Hindu nationalism finds him very difficult. I mean, they don't know what to do with him, to be honest. I mean, they could build a statue. I mean, that's one thing they do very well. But I'm not sure that will help.
When you, the term radical equality is yours, but in it you are attempting to distill both strands of thought. What do you mean by radical equality? And obviously in that, what is radical about the idea of equality? It's something we have enshrined as an ideal, and I think nobody in an audience like this, and you alluded to that earlier, nobody in the audience would argue against equality. What then is so radical?
One very significant, the radicality of this equality stems from this one very significant break that Ambedkar and Gandhi make. And this is what I try to capture in the subtitle of my book, The Risk of Democracy. Democracy for them is a risk. It's not a normative certainty that we will have a good democracy. It needs to be perfected, it needs to be honed, it needs to be refined, and it's a process. Democracy is something that is always yet to come, and they both take a certain risk. Here is the risk in the simplest term. They are both willing to see a democracy in which majority decision, which is, it's an invincible proposition. It's an arbitrary one. Remember, in the entire history of democratic or non-democratic political thought, Europe, American, Indian, and so on, there has never been a sustained attempt to understand why the majority principle should actually function like this. Or why should it be taken as invincible? Why should the majority decide for the entire body politic, right? And Ambedkar and Gandhi, to me, share this skepticism, and that's a polite word here, towards the majority decision. Not because it can be completely renounced, but because there has never been a democracy in which at some point majority decision has not mutated into majority rule. And it is that tyranny of the majority is what they critique. What makes this equality radical is their desire or their sustained attempt to formulate a democratic form of equality that does not depend on the majoritarian consensus, but actually something that breaks from the very logic of measure or number. We want to be more equal if more of us raise our hands in the audience whether we want equality. On the contrary, we would be more equal if we never felt felt compelled to actually make that vote in the first place.
Is there a way to distill the Ambedkar vision of politics into a practicable one?
I believe absolutely. And I think Ambedkar's moral vision is very simple. It's that we will have to undo the long history of purist politics, the idea of purity, the idea that we are Indian, the idea that if we come to power again, we will send everyone packing except these two groups. And so the original view. If we are willing to renounce that love of our origin and instead anchor our moral vision or our everyday life in something that is based in friendship. Did we lose some of these great ethical insights into Ambedkar? He writes on issues like friendship in politics, for example. He writes on finitude or our mortality or our pain. He writes about exile and homelessness. In 1931, he made Gandhi very famously declared, Gandhiji, I have no homeland. How does a man who has no homeland end up writing the world's longest written national constitution? It's a great irony that the world's longest written constitution, not national, actually is the state of Alabama, which still has to learn some lessons in racial equality. And that proves Ambedkar's point about constitutional skepticism.
So we're pretty much out of time. I'm going to shift gear rather dramatically away from both Ambedkar and Gandhi and back to you, talking of purity. There is a story here about the fact that you started out in life not being called Aishwary Kumar. You were called Aishwary Ghosh. How did you arrive at the name Kumar?
There is something in the world called poetic justice. And I think one of the things Ambedkar says is, the Hindu does not, there's a myth we love to cultivate growing up, that there was back in the 19th century, the idea that the Hindu loses his caste once he travels on the high seas or he crosses the 7 seas. And Ambedkar inverts it and says the Hindu carries his caste over the 7 seas, and one of the ways he carries it is through his family name or surname. Everything is distilled into the surname that you have. And I think there's some justice that I give, although my reasons were different. And back then, I loved Kishore Kumar. I wanted to sing like him, and that was it.
And can you sing like him?
Not at all.
Can we allow this audience to be a judge of that?
I will say that I do believe in something that Kishore Kumar really made possible, which was that you could sing like God even when you were not trained. So that I share.
But you will not give us one line of one song.
Well, since you've asked for an audience vote, I would like to know what they want to hear.
I thought we had agreed that the majoritarian impulse will not dictate the answer.
There can absolutely be no good comeback after this. Since I'm working on a book for some time on Algebra, let me just sing a line from one of Panchama's composition. Pancham, as we know, is the 5th note.
song.
This is from Amar Prem.
ये क्या हुआ, कैसे हुआ, कब हुआ, क्यों हुआ, जब हुआ, तब हुआ, छोड़ो ये न सोचो, ये क्या हुआ.
That's called celebrating giants of the intellect as well as of the soul. Thank you for indulging that. So Aishwary's book is not yet available, but Navyana Publishers, and I think it's interesting, I think in 2014 they also published an updated version of Ambedkar, and the same publishers are now publishing his book, hopefully later this year.
They've just acquired the rights from Stanford University.
So, Radical Equality, we will alert you when the book is published, but till then, Aishwary, thank you very much for attempting to distill a very complex understanding of